Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully, you can hear me okay. Just to say a huge hi, hello, welcome. We're really excited to be able to present to you today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Christina. I am an Education USA advisor with the US UK Fulbright Commission here in London, and I'm really excited to be able to talk to you today. Just a little bit of housekeeping information. This webinar is recorded. We'll be able to share a recording of this session after, so in case you don't catch anything or you kind of need to review some of the content that I'm talking about today, you'll be able to do so. In this webinar, we are going to cover the basics of studying in the US, generally at the undergraduate level. And we're going to talk about a few different areas, but in particular, the process of choosing a university to study at in the US, how to fund, an opportunity to study in the US, and we'll also talk about the application process and how that works. There is going to be an opportunity to take questions at the end. You should have access to a Q&A box. So if you've got any questions, feel free to pop those in there, and then we'll try and get to as many questions as possible at the end of this session. And I'll say this again at the end, but if we're not able to, or if you've got more questions that you want to kind of follow up on, I'll also signpost you to how you can get in touch with us beyond this webinar. I'm just going to keep open the chat just in case there's any issues or if you need to kind of check in about anything. But otherwise, I will get started. Perfect. Okay. So just a little bit about us, about Education USA. So Education USA is an advisory service. It's part of a global network that comes under the umbrella of the US State Department. There are over 400 advising centres across the world that help to guide international students on US study and to help support and give advice on all of the processes that are involved in that. In the UK, we're based within the US UK Fulbright Commission, as I said, in London. And the Commission and Education USA are paired up to help people explore education in the US, both at an undergraduate level, but also at a graduate level. At a graduate level, the Commission grants a number of awards and scholarships to talented students. And then more broadly, our aim as Education USA advisors is to offer free, unbiased advice to help UK students study in the US. As I said, we're really happy to be here today to talk about the undergraduate experience in more detail. So one of the first kind of areas that I wanted to talk about or highlight is why you might consider studying in the USA, and why the USA and not the UK, right? So there are a couple of different reasons. I've put some on screen just to kind of highlight. So firstly, there are over 4,500 US universities that can offer an undergraduate degree in the US compared to about 120 in the UK. And then within that, there are a huge range of personality and styles and variety. So as I said, studying in the US can offer that variety. It can also offer some really great opportunities. And US universities are known for their reputation. There are a full range of programs that are on offer, and these universities are also producing groundbreaking research as well. We'll advise you to focus on something called fit when you're trying to narrow down. How do you start with 4,500 universities? How do you kind of narrow it down to that one that is the right fit for you? So we'll talk a little bit about that throughout this session. And that will allow you to think about how you might find high quality universities, many of which you may have never even heard of. The other thing to be aware of is that US universities are known for having a really vibrant campus life. They really encourage students to be involved not just inside the classroom, but actually outside of the classroom. So they spend a lot of time and investment in making that a really great experience for their students. So there's going to be a lot of encouragement of being involved in extracurriculars outside of the classroom. And that could be things like music, if you're interested in that could be an a cappella group, orchestras, dance, sports, leadership, politics. There's many different opportunities of ways that you can be involved and you can contribute to the life on campus at a university. One fun example that I have of the things that you could do, Wisconsin University, for example, has the opportunity for students to take up log rolling, for example. The other thing that will attract students to the US, particularly UK students, is this idea of a liberal arts curriculum. US universities follow this idea. It's an educational idea based on this idea of having a well-rounded education, which means that you as a student have flexibility to explore interests before you ultimately select a major. So there's a chance to try different study topics and a different combination of them than perhaps what we're used to seeing in the UK, where you have a more restricted pathway, where you pick your subject focus before you even start at university in the UK. Whereas in the US, you don't do that. You have the opportunity to try things, try different topics, and then start to narrow down your focus based on your interests as you've kind of been learning about them. So an example of that, we know, for example, students that started with a very clear idea of wanting to do biomedical engineering, but actually pivoting to global gender studies after taking a class on feminism. So there's some opportunities to try some things out there. The other thing to say is that there's a huge focus on teaching and on creating an engaging classroom environment and on participating, which can be very attractive to some people. The other thing I wanted to flag is funding opportunities. This might be surprising to some. We'll talk about funding in just a little bit, but it is another top reason that the US can be a really attractive option. There are opportunities to find a variety of scholarships in the US that work differently and allow a little bit more flexibility, perhaps compared to the UK loan-based program that we see here with student finance. Another thing to be thinking about is studying abroad. Studying in the US is an opportunity to internationalize your CV. Studying abroad is really appealing to employers. You're able to demonstrate this boldness to do something different. You're gaining interpersonal skills, experiencing, communicating on, living and working alongside different cultures. So there's an opportunity to kind of demonstrate that, through your degree. And it gives you the opportunity to build a network of friends and professional contacts around the world that could serve you, in your wider career. There's also opportunities to work whilst you're in the US. So whilst you are out there with a student visa, you have the opportunity to work up to 20 hours per week during term time on campuses, and 40 hours per week during holidays. And then there's also an opportunity to work up to a year after graduation. And so some students are able to tailor that to their career interests, to their academic interests, research opportunities. So it can offer that opportunity as well. And then also thinking about culture, right? This tends to be a big pull to international students that want to experience the US and all that it has to offer. It's really important to remember that the US spans across 6 different time zones, and there's a real great diversity in geography and culture across the US. So if you want to live and breathe and experience what it's like to be a student in a specific state, in a specific area of the US, then studying in that area is an opportunity to do that. There's also, different to the UK, but the US university system has some very long summer holidays compared to what we see in the UK. And so there's opportunities to use that to explore, to take advantage of some of the friendships that you're making at US universities, to visit their homes across the country as well. And, living on campus, you're going to have an opportunity to learn more about US culture just by engaging with your roommates, your classmates, perhaps your professors. And there'll be activities and national holidays that are also happening around you that again really give you an opportunity to kind of experience that US culture as well, if that's of interest to you. So those are the things that you might want to be thinking about and kind of understanding why the US as a study destination could be an attractive option. There are some differences, obviously, between studying in the US, studying in the UK, that I just wanted to draw your attention to. Um, Typically, in terms of the duration, US bachelor's degrees are a 4-year degree versus 3 as we see in the UK. Um, as I mentioned earlier, you're not required to pick a specific course when you start at a US university, and actually, when you're applying for US study, you're not applying to a particular academic department or a particular course. You are applying for admission to the university as a whole. And again, as I was saying, that reflects this liberal arts curriculum, this idea that you don't need to choose a major or what you graduate in until later, in comparison to, as I said, those course specific degrees in the UK. Something to be aware of is that there is less government control and standardization in the US compared to UK universities. And there's a positive in this. It means that there's more institutional diversity and freedom, going back to, as I was saying, this idea of there being 4,500 institutions and them having a lot of variety amongst them. It does mean, on the flip side, that there's no set fees or centralized admissions process, which we'll talk about in just a little bit when we look at the application process, but it's something to be aware of. The application process itself is slightly longer and it's more in depth because the admissions process follows this idea of holistic admissions. This idea is basically that it's more than just your grades and meeting a specific grade requirement. There isn't an equivalent exactly to UCAS, which is generally what we use in the UK, but we have got information that's coming up in this webinar, but also on our website, that can help you navigate the application process as well. The other thing to be very aware of, particularly if this is important to you, you apply for your funding alongside your application for admission, not after you are admitted. So it's really important, if you're looking to access funding to be able to attend a university in the US, you need to be thinking about that and applying for that at the same time as applying to the university. There are a couple of exceptions, some things to think about. If you're interested in studying law and medicine, it's important to be aware that there's a different kind of pathway and process for this. Law and medicine in the UK is studied at the undergraduate level, but in the US it can only be studied at a postgraduate level. So if you're particularly interested and keen to study law and medicine, you might need to be thinking about whether or not, if you want to do that at the undergraduate level, that the UK is a better fit for that. If you're thinking about that and doing that in the US, then you need to be aware that there's a longer path, and it would require you to be applying at a postgraduate level as well. There's information on our website about that as well. But yeah, some things to be aware of. Some other things I wanted to highlight in terms of differences is more around some of the terminology that you might be coming across, particularly, depending on where you're at in your journey, but some of the things you might be finding on websites and that we're referring to in these webinars. There are some differences in language between the US, UK, and particularly around the systems, the education systems. So in the US, they will refer to students that are at the high school level and that are in grades 9 to 12, which corresponds to us in the UK to our secondary school, and years 10 to 13 if you're in England and Wales, or years 11 to 14 if you're in Northern Ireland, and then S3 to S6 in Scotland. So these are kind of how they map across. In the US, the term college, university, school, institution, you'll hear me say this in this webinar as well. Generally, those are used interchangeably. What we refer to as university in the UK is essentially what is being referred to as a college, university, school, or institution in the US. So whereas college to us might mean something different in the UK, in the US it doesn't mean, for example, that a degree is worth less. And in fact, actually, is used more commonly in the US than the term university. So it's just something to be aware of if you're reading and coming across those. The other thing to be aware of is that in the UK, we refer to, modules, the things that you do and learn and study as part of a degree. In the US, that tends to be referred to as classes or courses. Similarly, in the UK, we refer to a course, as I just said, but in the US, you are generally it's being referred to as a degree program or a major. So again, these are just some key terminology differences that are helpful for you to be thinking about and aware of as you research your programs and schools and kind of begin to dig into the research. Okay, so in terms of the application timeline and kind of how this process starts to map out across the years, we recommend beginning to research universities about 12 to 18 months before you're looking to enroll, i.e. attend that university. So that's typically at the end of year 12, if you're, as I said, in England and Wales. You register for any admissions exams, standardised admissions exam. We'll talk about this in a second. But you would also be registering for that and aiming to take that in the summer after year 12. And then what you're going to want to do is finalise a selection of where you would be applying in the early autumn of year 13, or about 10 to 12 months before you plan to enrol. Again, I'll talk in a bit more detail about some of these steps later on in this session. About 8 to 10 months, or the autumn of year 13, you're going to want to start putting together your applications and submitting them according to the university deadline for admission. It's really important to bear in mind, as I said, universities don't have standardised deadlines and processes, and that means that each university will have its own deadline for applying. So it's really important that you're making note of that as you're looking at universities, at colleges. It's not like how we have in the UK, a set UCAS deadline, for example. And then in the spring of year 13, about 4 to 7 months before you intend to enrol, you can expect to hear back from universities that you've applied to with their admissions decision. And based on where you were accepted, you will notify universities of your decision and apply for a visa to be able to attend, travel to the US and study in the US as a student about 1 to 3 months before you're due to enrol. We have a lot of resources on our website to help with pre-departure and preparing for that. That includes travel advice, living arrangements, campus life. So please do have a look at our website if you've got questions on that. And then something to be aware of is that this is slightly earlier than in the UK, but you would typically start your studies at a US university around mid-August to early September. So that kind of, like I say, is slightly earlier. And this is hopefully a helpful sense of what that timeline looks like. So before we kind of dive into some of the nitty-gritty of how you apply, what's really important is to think about how you go about choosing a university. Choosing is a really important step in the process of applying, and it's important that you give yourself enough time to do this, as I said. So my top tip is that you spend about 80% of your time and effort in researching and choosing the universities that you're interested in, and maybe about 10-20% in actually applying. And that's because it's really important that you make inroads, that you understand the universities, that you make the right choice in terms of fit, what is right for you and what you're looking for, before you move to apply. The really key thing that we want you to take away from this is that you are being as flexible as possible and that you're being open-minded. As I said, there are over 4,500 universities in the US. It's a really daunting process. And as you look to narrow down your prospects, it can be difficult to think about how you might do that. So we'll discuss some strategies that you can implement that helps you narrow down and feel confident that you're making the right fit decisions about the right universities for you. So what are some important things to consider in the choosing process? So it's really important that you know the context of the US as you research applying to the US, that you understand how things work in terms of the application process and things like that. But it's really important that you're considering a lot of different things here. So firstly, it's important to note that there's no national set standard for universities. Universities are free to choose their own fees, their course structures, their student environments. So there's going to be a lot of variety and diversity for you to be researching and understanding when you're looking at specific universities. This differs to the UK, where, as I said, institutions will have a set fee, and they have fairly similar environments and feels. So as I said, there's so much variety and diversity. That's what we talked about as being one of the draws to study in the US. And it can seem daunting, but it's also a great thing to know that there are so many universities out there that there has to be, there's bound to be a university that is the right fit for you. So it's important, as I said, that you're spending time, you're doing that research, that you're being open-minded and really spending that time to figure out what's important for you. We'll talk about funding in a little bit, but I do want to kind of plug it in here, right? If funding is important to you, then this needs to be considered from step one of the choosing process. You only want to be applying to universities that realistically you could afford to attend, or that are able to offer the funding that you need as an international student to be able to attend. As I said, we'll talk about this later on, but it's really important that you're factoring that in. The other thing to be aware of is, there are no guarantees in this process. It's important that you think about alternative options, backup plans. It's hopefully helpful and reassuring to know that you can complete UCAS applications, UK applications, or non-UK. You can apply to other universities outside of the US alongside applying to the US. So it's good to be thinking of that, and also something that you might want to be thinking about when you're looking at your UK options. And we'll talk about this is, are there universities in the UK and courses in the UK that would allow you to study abroad in the US as part of your degree? So that could be an alternative if you're not able to make the full 4 years work in terms of studying in the US. It's just important that you're mindful of deadlines as you're kind of thinking about that. Perfect. In terms of determining your fit, the first step in this process is to really locate what factors are important to you. I've mentioned fit a lot. We focus a lot on it. And it's because it's important that you're finding a school and a program that is right for you in terms of what you're looking for, both personally and perhaps also your, not perhaps, definitely your academic interest. So there are some factors that you're going to want to consider both in and outside of the classroom. You might want to think about the types of programs and departments and location of the university. You're going to want to look at, as I said, the availability of funding, if that's important. Campus size, is it important to you that you're in a large research university where there's lots and lots of students, or would you find a smaller liberal arts college that has a much smaller student population more comfortable for you? And like I said, with location, do you want to be in a city? Do you want to be in a suburb? Is it a specific part of the US that you're looking for? And then, like I said, you want to look at that academic environment as well. Is it rigorous? Is it competitive? Is it inclusive? Is that what you're looking for? Do you want something supportive? Do you want there to be a very kind of established international community that you can fall in, or any other communities that are important to you? So these are things to be thinking about. And then you can start to think about what is the most important, what is the priority, what are things that you would compromise on, if you needed to be flexible. And like I say, it's asking these questions, right? And thinking about what's important. As I said, if you don't like the cold and snow, perhaps the East Coast is not the right fit for you. If you're wanting to if funding is important, you're wanting to think about saving money and saving on living expenses. Living in an urban place is going to be definitely more expensive than perhaps living in somewhere more rural. And then again, thinking about specific states and the costs of living in those states. Ultimately what you want to know is the university you're looking into, like, does it match what you want out of them as well? These are the types of questions that are going to be really important. And we really encourage you to think beyond rankings. There are so many institutions in the US. Rankings don't work in the US like they do in the UK. And so we encourage you to focus on a variety of factors. Those rankings are different. Some don't rate the quality of teaching or graduate prospects. Some give more weight into how much money a university have, or even have kind of a peer ranking system. So you can look at them, but we encourage you to use them or kind of take them with a pinch of salt. and to make sure that it's not the only method that you're using when you choose a university. Importantly, within this process, we want to make sure that you're only applying to universities that you've researched and that you could genuinely see yourself attending for up to 4 years if you were offered a place, right? So it's really important that you're kind of investing and thinking about that. In terms of kind of next steps, so hopefully you've done that thinking, you've asked those questions, you've got a list of what your priorities are, and you know what factors are important to you and what type of institutions you might be looking at. But the next step then is to think about how you use that information to begin researching universities. Unlike UCAS, where you're limited to 5 universities that you can apply to, in the US, with the US application system, in theory, you could apply to as many as you like. I wouldn't recommend you apply to 4,000 institutions. I think that would take up a lot of your time. So for time and also financial reasons, we would recommend applying to somewhere between 6 to 10 universities. Obviously, that is something to think about. You're going to want to then be thinking about how you narrow down 4,500 institutions to 10 to 20 schools that you think could be a good fit for you. So you might be thinking, how do you do this? And we have a lot of resources on our website, on our choosing section of our undergraduate guide on our website, that also includes a list of links to search engines that can help you with the processing of narrowing down your choices of universities based on certain criteria or things that you're looking for. And this is one of the search engines that's linked on our website. It's called Big Future, the Big Future College Search. And there's a variety of filters that you can choose, which include searching by the type and size of school, the location by state, the majors that are on offer. And so, as I said, this is where you can start applying some of those factors and priorities that you've been thinking about. You can start to narrow down. As I said, without any filters, you'll be stuck with 4,500 universities listed. But as you start to apply those filters, that will hopefully start to narrow that down, that total down to a manageable number. The other thing to say is you can't just rely on the search engines. You're going to want to use that as a starting point, but then you're going to want to check the information that you're finding through that with the school websites, the university websites themselves. And that it's on those individual sites that you will find out much more about their application process, the funding that they have available, campus life, any of the kind of things that you're wanting to find out and understand, you will find in a lot more detail on the university website. So once you've got that list from your engine, you've narrowed down your options. As I said, you're going to want to research them further and possibly even reach out to them directly, ask questions. Your goal is to look at kind of selecting 6 to 10 institutions where you would actually submit an application. We suggest, as a guide, that you apply to 2 schools that are kind of reach schools, so schools that you'd be thrilled to attend, but it could be a challenge. It would be a challenge for you to get in. What I would say is that if you're thinking about applying to an ultra competitive university, so universities like Yale, Stanford, MIT, Caltech, Princeton, these are ultra competitive. They are reach schools for anyone, for everyone. So no matter how your grades or achievements kind of line up, they would be considered kind of, challenge competitive. So then you're going to want to look at 3 to 4 match schools where your profile is roughly on par with their average applicant. You're then going to want to look at 2 likely admittance schools. So these are schools that, you can think of, if you're trying to map this to the UK system, think of it as like your UCAS insurance choices where your application would be very competitive. And as I said, the best place to get information from these universities is on their website. Places that you can look to help you kind of identify how they might fall and also whether they're the right fit. As I said, you can look at their website. So looking at their profile of the average admitted applicant, you should be able to find that on their website. You can do some research on their websites into the programs they have available, campus life. You can have a look at virtual tours that are usually on offer, information about student life, sports, student housing, funding. So you can spend a lot of time just learning from a university website. What's also going to be really important is that you're looking at what resources they have for international students. as well as the different universities, will offer different levels of support. So it's important that you're kind of looking at that and comparing them against each other to see what's the right fit for you. Other places that you can have a look at, most universities should have a social media channel or channels that you can use to really get a feel for the college. You can discover that through that, more on the university's personality, what they're focused on. So it's a good way to kind of gather some additional information on what they're like, whether that's Instagram, YouTube, all of those types of things. As I said, you can also reach out to universities. They want to hear from you as a student. So you can reach out to them, you could email them. What's really important, as I said, they want to hear from the student, not the parent or guardian. So it's really important that if you're a parent, a guardian, you want to be supportive in this process, but you want the student to put themselves forward, because ultimately that's who the university is looking to admit. What I'm going to do now is just give you a few examples of some universities that you might not have heard of, and then you can kind of get a sense on why they could be a good fit and why it's important to be flexible when you're going through the choosing process. So, this is Middlebury College. It's a small liberal arts college in Vermont. It's in the northeast of the US, and things to know, again, thinking about fit, thinking about factors, Vermont has lovely summers, cold winters, however, and it has its own ski mountain. It's well known, Middlebury is well known for languages, for climate change courses, and kind of research, and climate science. So those are kind of some courses that you could be thinking about. It's a small university with a focus on undergraduate studies. There are actually no graduate students at Middlebury College, and the small size means that there's lots of access to professors and opportunities to form close relationships, because they are focused on supporting undergraduate students and not undergraduates and postgraduates. So this is an example of a really great top university that you might have heard of, but is actually great, but also super selective to get into. Scripps is another college. It's located in Claremont, California, outside of LA. It's a liberal arts college, again, with some really top professors. It's a college for women or for female identifying students only. And so it's a really great space for women to find their voice. It has some really great programs. For example, they have a program on museum studies and conservation. And really importantly, or something to note, and this is not the only example of this, but it's part of what's called a consortium of 5 universities that share the same campus. And that is a consortium of Scripps, Harvey Mudd, Pitzer, Claremont McKenna, and Pomona. Consortiums are really great. They will allow you an opportunity to cross-register for classes across the other universities or colleges that are in that consortium. And so you might find that there are students that are attending the same class, but are actually studying under a different university, each of which have their own unique identity. But it's a way to access additional resources and opportunities across not just one college, for example, but actually 5. So consortiums can be a really great thing to be thinking about, and something that we're not familiar with in the UK. And then another kind of final example is Vanderbilt University. This is an example of a much bigger university. Its home is Nashville, Tennessee, the home of country music. It's got a really vibrant campus with a huge culture and art scene. It's very green, and it's close to downtown Nashville. So it's an example of a larger institution. It's got a lot of research hospitals as a research university, and it's got a really big engineering program. So this all kind of contributes to this kind of big university feel. So these are 3 examples of different universities, all great, but all in their own unique way. So again, this just gives you like a flavour of the way in which different universities can kind of really have that variety and that distinction. Before we talk about funding, one thing that I kind of want to talk about is a note on the Ivy League, which is a name that might be familiar to some of you, might not be, but is something that often comes up. So one thing to note is that the Ivy League is historically a sports league between the 8 oldest universities in New England. It's not the equivalent to the Russell Group, which is what we're familiar with in the UK. And no university can become an Ivy League college. As I said, it's a historical sports league. So there are a few universities that people in the UK think are part of the Ivy League. Things like, universities like MIT, Stanford. They are not. Again, it's this idea of this kind of 8 old universities that are part of a sports league. All of the universities in the Ivy League are private research universities, and if ultimately what we want you to kind of take away from this is that if you are focusing on these, you are limiting your opportunities to explore the other types of institutions that are out there, some of which I've just talked about: liberal arts colleges, women's colleges, or even specialist institutions. And we put Ivy League schools in the ultra competitive bracket. Some have an admission rate of 1 to 2%. So it's really something to be aware of. Oxford, to compare, has an 18% admission rate, and Cambridge has 21%. So just to give you an idea of how incredibly competitive this is, something to be aware of if you're trying to kind of maximize your opportunities for success in this process. As I said, whilst we advise you to look at rankings with caution, it's important to note that the top 1% of US universities would be the equivalent to over 40 institutions, which is not a lot when you're looking at 4,500. Liberal arts colleges that are highly regarded and competitive will be part of this 40, but they'll never be considered an Ivy League or as well known in the UK, despite being top quality. So something to kind of take away is that just because you haven't heard of a university and you're kind of thinking about universities that you've heard of that might form part of this Ivy League, it doesn't mean that university, that college is not a good fit. It's just about being open-minded and kind of broadening your perspective and awareness of what is out there. So in terms of funding, this is one of the top things we get asked about, understandably so. So in this section, we're going to run through the costs that you can anticipate for studying in the US, the different sources of funding that you can pull from, and some strategies that you can implement to help find funding opportunities as well. Some of the costs that you can expect. As I mentioned, every university can set their own tuition and fee rates, their own costs. It's not standardized like in the UK. Before we get to kind of the university cost itself, in terms of the application, it's the first kind of thing to be aware of. There are costs associated with applying to the US. If the university has a requirement for admissions test scores, so the SAT, the ACT, those currently cost somewhere between 100 to 200 US dollars to complete. So it's something that you'll need to be kind of factoring in. Each university will also have an application fee, typically somewhere between $50 to $100. But something to be aware of is that many universities can offer fee waivers, or there are some institutions that do actually offer a free application to eligible applicants. Something also to be aware of is visa fees. So this ability to actually go to study in the US, you need to apply for a visa. There is a fee associated with that, associated with an appointment at the embassy. So it's important that you're kind of factoring that in and thinking about that as part of your budget if you're looking to apply to the US. As I mentioned, in terms of studying in the US and the costs associated with attending that university, costs can vary significantly because each university can set their own fee rates. Fees are mandatory. They typically cover things like the student union, school athletics, membership to the university gym, kind of some of the costs of being on campus. There is like a lot of understandably like perceptions and misconceptions about the cost of studying in the US. Try not to be put off by the sticker price. The cost of attendance is including tuition fees, room and board, and any personal expenses, which ultimately are costs that you can also expect if you're attending a UK university. It's just that in the US that's being listed in full, whereas in the UK they're generally listing just the tuition and fees. Other thing to be thinking about is that cost of living and other expenses. So whilst the cost of attendance includes things like room and board and some expenses, you are going to also have to be thinking about other living costs, whether that's health insurance, the cost of eating out, clothing, entertainment. Ultimately, those are the types of costs that will vary depending on where your university is located. So the cost of rent, if you're choosing to live off campus, is going to vary. Or if you need a car to travel to class because you're off campus, or if there's public transport that you can use, there's different costs that you can expect that are going to vary, but they're things that you need to be aware of. So I talked about the costs, but I do want to say that there is good news here, right? There are a variety of funding opportunities that are available. It is possible to have an affordable US university education, and many students find that they're able to fully fund their studies without taking out loans. But what's going to be really important here is putting the time and effort into seeking out and applying for funding that requires you to be flexible, stay flexible on your options. So in terms of where the money, so the cost of attending a university, how you meet that, where does that come from? I'll go into more detail for each of these sources, but I thought it'd be helpful to kind of give you a summary of the four typical sources of funding for study in the US. So the first is personal family funds. US universities operate on a premise and understanding that families prioritize a student's education and they invest in that education generally from when the child is born. So they expect your family to contribute in some form. So you do have to keep in mind that there will be something that you and your family have to pay. Another source that comes from that's important is actually what comes from US universities themselves. So there's two types of funding. There's need-based financial aid and merit-based scholarships, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Now, the amount of funding that a US university can offer is going to vary greatly from university to university. And this is why I was saying earlier, if financial aid is really important to you, you need to look for that. You need to be aware of that and apply only to universities that can offer the funding that you would need as an international student to attend. There are also some external funding bodies that you can look at. Again, I'll talk about those in detail. And then there's also loans. Now, we advise loans to be your final resort. You can't take a UK student loan to the US, and US-based loans would require you to have a US citizen or a permanent resident co-sign the loan. You could look at taking out UK third-party loans, but we really caution you to be careful about that, right? You need to be very aware of the high interest rates, the payback terms, so things that are really, really important if you're kind of going to that resort. Now, if you do have US citizenship or you're a dual citizen, you can take out a loan and apply for federal loans through what's called the FAFSA, which is a financial aid application for domestic students. We have more information on that on our website if you fall into that category, because that's an additional funding pool that you could access. What's important to kind of keep in mind is that you're going to likely pull from some or all of these resources and sources to fund your education. It's perhaps unlikely that it will just be one single source of funding here. So in terms of the university funding is great. It's ideal. It doesn't need to be paid back. We're talking about scholarships and grants. And there are two types of university funding. As I said, there's the need-based financial aid and then there's scholarships. University funding, generally that's need-based, is likely to be awarded on the basis of financial need, which is based on your family's kind of financial situation, your family's annual income, assets, and things like that. If you're looking at scholarships that are merit-based, that could be based on academic merits, so perhaps your A-level marks, admissions test scores, or perhaps specific niche criteria, whether that's sports, or a combination of all three. You may find that you get offered funding that kind of meets a couple of those different areas. In terms of the financial aid, there's a few different types. Need-based financial aid, as I said, is based on financial needs. So a university will calculate what they expect your family to be able to contribute based on your family financial situation. They will compare it to the cost of attendance, the total cost of attending, and then they will try to meet the difference. Now, the amount that they can meet is going to vary from university to university. Some will commit and be able to meet 20% of that gap, or 80%, and some 100%. Every university will do this differently. So it's important that you're looking for this information as you're doing your research if you need funding to get you to the US. What's going to be really important also is that you are looking specifically at information for international students, because universities will have different policies for internationals versus domestic students, for example. And it's the same when you're looking at scholarships, right? There will be some that are open to any applicant and some that are just open to domestic students or international students. If you are a top athlete, sports scholarships might also be available for you through an athletic recruitment process. And there's a lot of information about that on our website that you can kind of look into if you think that that applies to you. Really importantly, as you're looking at university funding, is that you're checking, as I said, the university website. That's going to be where you find the most up-to-date information that you need. You might need to be proactive. You might need to ask questions. Sometimes that information isn't super easy to find. It's there, but you kind of need to dig for it, or you might need to ask specific questions to the university. You also, as I said, need to apply if university funding is a requirement. If it's something you're really going to need to be able to go, then you need to apply at the same time that you apply for admission. The process of applying is generally straightforward, but it's integrated into the application process, but it's something that you need to be aware of. In terms of external funding bodies, so these are bodies that can include like a wide range of professional, charitable, or government organisations that are external to the university. So they could be thought of as niche scholarships that might have specific criteria based on the mission of the funding body. So it might be that they're looking for students from a particular country of origin, particular ethnicity, religious faith, or that they've got interest in a particular field, that they're doing specific talents, that they've got specific interests. Like all of these kind of very specific things will form part of their kind of criteria that they're looking for if they're wanting to award it. So, for example, you could find an external funding body that offers scholarships for female engineers. So if you're unique in any way, you may find that there's a funding body with a scholarship out there for you. You just need to find it. An example that I will throw out there is the Moorhead Keynes Scholarship. They offer a scholarship that's based on an applicant being able to demonstrate their leadership, their character, their scholarship, and their physical vigour. And they provide a 4-year fully funded education experience for students of the highest calibre at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So that's an example of one. There are thousands of funding bodies. Searching will require time. It will require you to kind of sift through the different listings, and you're going to likely need to submit separate applications for each. So it's something to be aware of because of how lengthy and kind of competitive and time consuming that process can be. We encourage students to first apply for university funding opportunities and then look at external funding. And we also have a link on our website to scholarship search engines, which again can provide a really great tool that you can use. So in terms of your funding strategy, things to be thinking about. You could explore universities that are in places with a lower cost of living. It's the same as in the UK, right? If you're looking at university in London, you may find that that's more expensive than a university in Lancaster. And it's the same in the US. New York and California are going to be more expensive states to live in than states like Ohio or Georgia. American universities have to list the costs on their website. So they will list the full estimated cost of attending. That includes tuition, fees, cost of living, personal expenses. So you can scope out those places from the get-go, and you can look at which have the lower cost of living just by doing that research. Another thing to look at are programs with lower tuition. As I mentioned, universities can charge what they like. There's no standard amount, but typically you'll find that state universities funded by the government will be more affordable in terms of the total cost of attending. And then, as I said, really be thinking about those funding opportunities and how you might be able to access them when you're doing your research into universities. Another thing to be thinking about from a funding perspective is community colleges. They're becoming an increasingly popular choice in the US as an alternative pathway that can help save a lot of money. Generally, they award associate degrees, which is not a degree that's offered in the UK, but it is a degree that often has a professional or vocational focus. They also have programs that can allow students to take what's called the 2+2 transfer pathway. And what this means is that a student will start their studies at a community college and then they can transfer to a 4-year university and receive a bachelor's degree from that university in another 2 years. Many colleges and universities have transfer agreements that make this easier. So, for example, Los Angeles Valley College is a 2-year community college that has a partnership with universities like UCLA, University of Southern California, or Cal Poly. So those are kind of examples of or one example of that. And why might this be attractive? As I said, community colleges are much less expensive than 4-year universities. So you could save thousands by paying significantly lower tuition of a community college for 2 of the 4 years that you'll be studying. The other thing to be aware of with community colleges, they have smaller class sizes, which can be especially valuable for introductory classes, which means there's more opportunities to have contact with professors. They also generally involve less rigorous application processes and the entry requirements compared to a 4-year university. So students that are studying and kind of qualifying with BTECs or other similar qualifications may find that they're able to apply to community colleges, and many will not require an admissions exam, so an SAT, ACT score for admission. If you want more information on community colleges, how they work, why they might be a great fit, you can look at that on our website. And there's also a link to a community college webinar that you can kind of access and learn more about in a lot more detail. So some other tips to be aware of from a funding perspective. Because applying for funding is simultaneous to the admissions process, as I said, you want to begin your search for funding early. It's going to take time to research those options at each school that you're going to want to apply to, and then also if you're looking at external scholarships. So it's important that you're kind of starting that process early. As I mentioned, best resources for funding are or finding out about funding is the university websites themselves, as well as online scholarship searches, which I've mentioned are linked on our website. You should consider having a funding strategy to help you along the way, right? It's important that you embed that into your process. You are going to need to be flexible. If you're looking to fully fund your studies, then you need a combination of all of the different types of funding we've talked about. You may need to look at family funds, university funds, external bodies, but you're going to want to investigate each of these and work out what's best for you. As I said, being flexible is really important here. Don't just apply to where thousands of other British students are applying to, where you won't be competitive. We've put a fishbowl on here. It's a really great visual reminder of this. You want to be tactical, strategic, and competitive. So you want to look at universities that have fewer international student applicants, where you'll be sure to stand out, not just from an admissions perspective, but also from a funding perspective as well. So I've talked about funding, but I want to kind of quickly go through how you complete an application or things to be thinking about. So in terms of the application process, universities are looking for a mix of different things. It works differently to kind of what we're seeing in the UK. US universities are going to look for academic achievements, measuring that by your results. So GCSEs, A-levels or equivalent. They're also going to be looking at admissions test scores if those are required. And you can check, as I said, university websites for the average applicant profile to compare your results with their student average student scores. So you can see how you compare. What's really important to bear in mind here is that academic achievement alone will not guarantee entrance to competitive US universities. It is what's called a much more holistic process than it is in the UK. In terms of academic fit, they want to understand why you would like to pursue a degree at their institution and how it helps you towards your goal. So, for example, if you want to be in New York, why are you applying to NYU over Columbia? Is there a particular program that one offers that the other doesn't? Is there a particular campus activity? Do you value one's missions over the others? You know, these are kind of things that you'll need to be able to demonstrate, this idea of fit. They are also going to look at what you're doing, not just inside the classroom in terms of your academic profile, but also what you're doing outside. Extracurriculars are a really big focus. They want to get a sense of what you're doing, how you're making an impact, how it's important to you, and kind of your interests and how you're able to demonstrate that. They're also going to look at your personal attributes, which sounds really different to what we're used to in the UK. But again, it comes back to this idea of the holistic admissions process. They want to look at the whole person not just the academics. They want to bring students that can diversify their campuses, their classrooms, that can make a contribution. So they want to know who you are and why you might be the right person to do that. So as I said, they'll look at your academic field of choice, they'll look at your overall interests, they'll look at your sense of character, any leadership abilities that you have, and they'll be thinking about how you can apply that to your time at their institution. In terms of the applicant or application components, unlike in the UK, you apply to each university individually rather than through a centralised body like UCAS. And as I said, you can apply to as many as you want, but for time and cost purposes, we'd recommend applying to 6 to 10 schools. There is an application website that's called the Common Application, which around 900 universities use to help streamline some of the questions and requirements that are being asked in the application process. But it's only 900 universities, as we talked about, there's 4,500, so you may find that you're applying to universities that have their own application portal, website, system. And even if you were using the Common App, it's not like UCAS where you submit the same answers for everything. You will still have to tailor parts of your application to each university. So there'll be different questions that are being asked. There'll be something called supplementary questions, supplementary essays that you'll need to complete that are specific to the university. And as I said, as a reminder, there's no standard process for applying. That includes things like deadlines, requirements. They're all going to vary by the university. So it's important that you kind of are looking at that as you're doing your research. That being said, most universities will follow a similar format, so you should be able to reuse or adapt the materials that you're preparing for each. Most will include an application form that has basic questions or questions on kind of basic demographics, who you are, where you live, what school you go to, those types of questions. Then it will start to ask for specifics. So again, if it's a university that's requiring or accepts test scores, they'll ask you to submit your SAT, ACT test scores. They'll ask you to submit a transcript, which is something that it demonstrates or shows your academic achievements and predictions. If you're kind of following, when you're applying in year 12, what you're expecting to achieve by the time you finish secondary school. They'll ask you to submit essays. And then they'll ask you to also submit what's called 2 to 3 letters of recommendation. These come generally from your school, from a teacher, from someone that you nominate to talk about you, to explain why they would recommend you to that university. So that's kind of 2 to 3 depending on the university. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there is generally an application fee that you'll need to also kind of submit. So those are kind of just a very simple summary of the components. There's a lot more information of that on our website as well. And I'll go into some detail on some of those in a second. In terms of admissions deadlines, as I said, every university can set their own deadlines, but there are kind of some different application cycles or pools that you can apply to be considered in. So if you're applying for what's called a regular decision application, you would typically apply by the 1st of January and you can expect to hear back at the beginning of April. This is what's called a non-binding, non-restrictive deadline. You can apply regular decision to as many universities that you like, as I said, but we recommend narrowing that down to 6 to 10. You may find that you apply early action to a university. This is when students typically apply by the 1st of November and they hear by the 15th of December. So this type of deadline is also non-binding, it's non-restrictive. You can apply to as many as you like. Then you've got what's called early decision. This is really important. There's 2 deadlines that you could apply early decision under. There is the early decision 1, which tends to be the beginning of November, so that has now passed. And then slightly less common, but there are some institutions that also allow you to apply ED2 to them, and that deadline is in January, which is coming up. The important thing to note about an early decision application is that you're making a binding commitment. So it means that you are committing to attending to that university if you are admitted. So it needs to be your first choice university worldwide. So US, UK, anywhere else is the university that is top of your list. And as I said, if you're accepted, then you would be expected to withdraw any other applications that you have open worldwide, and you're expected to follow through on your commitment and attend that university. So it's a really important commitment that you make. It's important that you understand the commitment you're making if you're applying early decision. There's one exception. If you're not funded, if you don't have the funding that would allow you to attend that institution, then you could decline that offer, but otherwise you would be expected to apply to attend. Why might you want to apply early decision? There are a few kind of different benefits. Firstly, you will hear back earlier, right? If you apply in November, you hear back in before January. You can be wrapped up and know where you're going a lot earlier on than some of these other deadlines, and actually potentially earlier than you might hear back on your UK options. The early decision pool is a smaller applicant pool, so it allows you to be competitive, strategic, to kind of hopefully stand out in a much smaller applicant pool compared to the numbers of students that might be submitting applications regular decision. It helps to demonstrate your interest, right? If you're making a commitment to attend that university, you're demonstrating your interest, your commitment to that institution. So it's a way to demonstrate that. And also, really importantly, from a funding perspective, there will be institutions where the most competitive deadline, the most competitive cycle is the early decision in terms of being able to access the most funding. And again, that's something really important to be aware of if funding is important to you. So if you apply early, as I said, you should receive a decision by the end of December. If you apply regular, then you'll receive a decision by the 1st of April. And there are different decisions that you can expect to achieve. You could be accepted. Great, that's amazing. You've been accepted to that institution, and obviously then you can enroll. If you are waitlisted, it means that they're not able to make a decision. So this is particular important in the early decision round, but generally it means that they've not been able to accept you at that time. You are added to a wait list, and if there are slots that open up as other students make their decision about enrolling, then you may be offered a place off the wait list. Then thirdly, the final kind of decision could be that you are not accepted and declined in terms of admission. What's really important if you are accepted to be aware of is that, unlike in the UK where we have what's called like conditional admissions, unconditional admissions, this isn't something that US universities offer. So they're not expecting to receive a certain score on your final year exams that helps you, that means that you can be admitted. But what it means is that they're expecting you to be the student that they have admitted, right? So they're expecting you to get as close to, or you're like ultimately to get or to be as close to getting the grades that you've been predicted by the end of your year 13 or equivalent. So it's really important that you are meeting your predictions, you're meeting what the university is expecting, and it's something to be really careful with, right? In extreme cases, if you are very, very fall very short of what you have said you will achieve, then a university could reconsider your admission in the summer. So something to be aware of. Okay. Other things to be thinking about, as I was saying, like in more detail, some of these components. So I've been talking about standardized admissions tests. What they kind of refer to is, or I guess some context to be aware of, is that unlike in the UK, in the US, there is no national curriculum at the secondary school level. So applicants vary in terms of their educational ability, quality, information from school to school, state to state. And so universities use a standardized test like the SAT, the ACT, which is set as a standard test that any student in the US, if they sit it on a specific date, is doing. And same if you're an international student and sitting it on the same date, it means that you're being assessed at the same level. So universities do value it, or some universities value that as a helpful part of the admissions process. An increasing amount of universities are test optional. You can have a look at this by looking directly at the university website. There will be some that are optional for international students, some that would still expect you to submit it. So something to be aware of. In terms of the SAT versus the ACT, no one is considered better than the other. They are it's just about thinking about what is the best fit for you. They work slightly differently. So the best way you can decide that is by taking a full length practice test. You can access free versions of those online. You can do both and then see which feels like the better fit for you in terms of how you did, kind of preference. They have slightly different times, slightly different questions, but generally what I would say is that the content and style is similar. And ultimately what they're looking at is, like I say, helping assess in a standardized way the ability of a student, the academic ability. As I mentioned in terms of transcripts, so this is a listing of your academic qualifications and marks that would cover your year 10 to 13. You're in England, Wales, 11 to 14, Northern Ireland, S3 to S6 in Scotland. Generally, your transcript is generated by your school, but you might need to provide your school with that information about what to include in a transcript, as well as any other additional school reports. So your transcript will include your years attended, your scores at GCSE level, and then your predicted A levels or equivalent for year 13. Importantly, there's no direct conversion between the UK and US marks. Schools should report your marks using the British system. So there shouldn't be any kind of converting of GPA, etc. It should just be what your grades are based on our UK system. US universities will do their own conversion, their own reviewing, once they've got the transcript, and many of them are reading applicants from the same pool, from the same countries, and are able to kind of understand the nuances of the different education systems. And then some, as I said, will ask for a school report, which will contain information about the school themselves. We have templates for both on our website and information about that, so it's something you can share with your school if they need support. You're, as I said, going to also need to put together or be required to gather recommendation letters. These are 2 to 3 letters. Ultimately, they're a marketing tool for you as an applicant, and they're ultimately aiming to have your referee, your recommender, talk about your ability to succeed at university, your ability to positively contribute to the university department, campus life, diversity, all of those types of things. So they're going to want to get a sense of you as a person, and that's something that your recommender can do. So they can talk about your leadership abilities, your character, as well as your involvement in your school and community. So this should be someone that knows you well, both in and outside of the classroom. The university that you're applying to may provide some loose guidelines for selecting referees. So, for example, they might say that they want one letter from a counsellor, which is someone that you can nominate in school, a teacher that you can nominate in school, but then they'll also want a letter that's from a subject teacher, likely. So someone that's teaching you on a specific course, and again, kind of on a more academic level. Generally, it's going to be your responsibility to choose and liaise with referees, recommenders, and to give them the information that you need. So I'd recommend meeting with them, helping them to write the best letter that they can. So helping them understand perhaps what you're doing outside of school that they don't know about, or talk about your reasons for why you want to do an undergraduate degree in the US, or why you're interested in a particular university or academic kind of path. So things that will help them to write the letter. You want to make sure that your recommender is aware of deadlines and what they need to complete. It's your responsibility to inform them of that, and to make sure that they submit those on time. And importantly, you want them to talk you up, right? You want them to write something that is going to be enthusiastic in tone. Remembering that we're coming from the UK, we tend to be a little bit more restrained, modest in how we talk about ourselves and other people. But American recommenders are writing in an enthusiastic tone. They're being very positive. They're using positive descriptive language. They're discussing the applicant both in and outside of the classroom. They're talking about their personality. And ultimately, they're writing for an American counterpart. So you want to make sure that your referees, your recommenders are thinking about that when they're writing a letter about you. You want them to boast about you, right? That's what the recommenders are doing. In terms of your application and some other areas that you'll be talking about, essays is going to be a really important part of the application process. Strong essays are going to be what could set you apart from another applicant. It gives you an opportunity to showcase yourself. These are not the same as your UK personal statement. It's not just about an explanation of your interest and achievements in a particular field of study that you're going to kind of do for UCAS. You're actually going to be asked to respond to 1 to 3 essay questions in your application. Each university will set their own questions as well as their own length for response. And what you'll tend to have if you're, for example, using the Common App system is that you'll have one essay question that goes to all universities, and then you'll have what's called supplemental questions, essay questions, which are unique to the institution. An example of one of the Common App prompts that you might be asked to, or that you can pick to write to, is reflect on a time when you questioned or challenged a belief or idea. What prompted your thinking and what was the outcome? Another example is describe a topic, idea, or concept you find so engaging that it makes you lose all track of time. Why does it captivate you? What or who do you turn to when you want to learn more? So this is just to give you a flavour of what these questions are like. They are not, like I say, like your UCAS personal statement. They are giving you an opportunity to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more reflective in your thinking, and able to kind of give a sense of who you are and who you might be on their campuses. So something to be aware of with your essays. And with your supplementals, it's unlikely that you'll be able to use exactly the same essays for every single university, but you might be able to reuse elements of them for different universities. And just some examples of these like supplemental questions, just, ultimately they want to get an idea of who you are. But they also want to show sometimes can show something about the university culture as well. So, for example, UChicago is known for its comedy and campus is like quirky, and that can be seen in their essay prompts. So one of their essay prompts is find X. Another is what's so odd about odd numbers. So this gives you a flavour of the type of university that Chicago is. Dartmouth is an Ivy League school in New Hampshire. It's deeply personal about their questions. This is one of them. So when you meet someone for the first time, what do you want them to know about you, but generally don't tell them? So again, just to give you a sense, this is not the same as a UCAS personal statement where you go on and on about your interest in a specific subject, right? This is about who you are as a person and what you can show to a university. In terms of some tips and things to be thinking about when you're writing that essay, you want to make sure that you're answering that question fully. You're going to want to be thinking about clear, concise language, that you're being clear, that you're avoiding vague or empty statements or cliches. And if you do reuse an essay, like a supplemental essay, you want to really be careful that you submit the correct essay to the correct university and program. There's nothing more awkward if you're making reference to the University of Chicago, but actually you're applying to Dartmouth, you see? So you want to make sure that they are correct, and also that they make sense for the university you're applying to and what you've understood about what their fit and kind of what they're looking for in a student. You also want to proofread extensively. You might want to ask others to proofread your essays to help offer you some feedback. What's really important, regardless of this, is that you are yourself, right? You want to give a true sense of who you are. Don't give an admissions officer the answer that you think they want to hear. They can see through that. They want genuine responses. They want to know what sets you apart. So you really want your personality to come through in the essay. We have a lot of tips on our website. We have links to some examples of essays on university websites, so you're more than welcome to go onto our website and learn about the application, but also the essays in an application in more detail. Okay, just some kind of final slides before we start to wrap up. I've talked a lot about undergraduate study from like a 4-year perspective, an undergraduate degree perspective, but you may be thinking, this is great, I don't know that a 4-year degree in the US is the right fit for me and what I'm looking for. So I wanted to just spend some time talking about some other opportunities that might help you have an experience and opportunity to study in the US, but perhaps on a more short-term basis or further down your kind of academic career. There are a few different opportunities. One thing to think about is UK universities and what they might offer in terms of university exchange programs. So the opportunity to go to the US through an exchange program, through a year abroad, by attending a UK university. And there are many UK universities that have established exchange programs with the US, with US universities or US-based study abroad programs. For example, the University of Manchester has partnerships with 18 universities in the US. This might be a better fit for you. It's more short term. It might be logistically simpler because your university can help to arrange that generally in your third year of university. You could also look at summer institutes. So, for example, the study of the US Institutes for Student Leaders. They are intensive short-term academic programs whose purpose is to provide groups of undergraduate student leaders with a deeper understanding of the United States, whilst also thinking about leadership skills. So those are kind of summer opportunities. If you really love America, American culture, American history, you can actually also spend your degree studying it. So there are American studies programs in the UK that will offer, as I said, the opportunity to study and learn about the various different aspects of America, but also will offer or can often offer a year abroad in the US as part of that degree as well. So that's also something to be thinking about. You also might want to be thinking about internships, summer work opportunities, whether that's things like Camp America, for example, all of which we have information about on our website. There's also postgraduate study. So you might be saying, actually, for my undergraduate degree, I would like to stay in the UK. This feels like the better fit for me, but perhaps at a postgraduate level, you want to consider that. We have a postgraduate study webinar coming up in a couple of weeks. So you're more than welcome to sign up for that if you want to learn more about that through a webinar. We've also got an extensive amount of website information on our website. And as I said, we sit within the Fulbright Commission. The Fulbright Commission offers Fulbright Awards, which is an award that gives funding and opportunity at a postgraduate level to study in the US. And again, there's a lot of information about that on our website. So in terms of how we can help going forward, if your kind of interest is piqued, you kind of want to learn more, you want to develop this further. So I'm just going to talk about a few different things that we can offer, support we can give to kind of help move that forward. Firstly, I just wanted to flag that within the Commission, we also have a programme that's called the Sutton Trust Fulbright US programme. This is a programme that's delivered in partnership with the social mobility organisation here in the UK, the Sutton Trust. It's a 2-year programme that's aimed at high-achieving Year 12 students that offers an opportunity for students to learn more about studying in the US, discovering US universities, and there's an opportunity to take part in online programming and sessions. And there's also residentials in the UK where you will receive support about how you can apply for undergraduate study in the US. Applications for this year have opened. They're open until kind of middle of January. So if you're interested and if you think you might be a good fit, you can find out more information about that on our website. And we also have a webinar that's coming up on kind of maximising the application process if that's of interest. And if you're not in year 12 but you're in year 11 and you're thinking about it, you've got some time to also think about that for next year. As you've noticed throughout this session, I've talked a lot about the website. I've referred to it a lot, and that's because there is a lot of advice, guidance, and information on our website. We also make reference to events that are coming up, whether it's webinars or in-person events. There's a wealth of information there. If you go to the section that's Education USA Advice, you will find information on undergraduate study in the US with details that specifically breaks down choosing, funding, applying, and ultimately attending a US university or preparing to attend a US university. So there's a lot of detail information on our website that I would really encourage you to go and have a look at. And then in our program section, you'll also find information about the Sutton Trust Fulbright US program as well, if that's of interest to you. In terms of kind of upcoming events, we hold online events such as this webinar regularly. There will be more coming up over the course of the year and into next year. And, if you miss them, then we have a whole range of videos that are covering these topics on our YouTube. And, we also take part and attend university fairs across the country. So you may actually see us at some of those events, over the course of the year. We're also able to support on a more one-to-one basis. We take questions by email. We check our inbox between Monday to Friday. And so you can reach out to us if you've got questions as you go along the process. You can find access to that or information about how you can contact us on our website. And we can work more directly with you if you've got specific questions. We also have USA College Day. So every year we host USA College Day in September. The dates are on the screen for the upcoming year. This is the biggest event of our calendar. We invite university representatives from across the US to exhibit at our fair. So it's a really great opportunity to meet directly with some of the people that might be making decisions about your application, but and student and reps that are working and studying and living at these colleges and universities. So it's a really great way to, particularly if you're trying to build research, understand what these different universities could offer you and how they might fit what you're looking for. It's a really great event to come to. It's a free event, so there's no cost for attending. All you would need to do is register to attend in advance, and you'll see that there's a QR code on the screen. So if you sign up to our mailing list, which is through that QR code, you'll receive a notification of when registration opens. It tends to be kind of late summer that you'll receive information about registering to attend that fair. But it's a really great opportunity, so one I definitely encourage. Perfect. Okay. We have got some time for some Q&A. What I'm going to do is just give an opportunity for anyone that's joining or just joining to ask those questions in the Q&A. I'm going to come off camera for about a minute, and then what I'll do is kind of take some of those questions and we can kind of hopefully help answer those. And if you've got a question that isn't answered or something that's very more, much more specific to you, then you're more than welcome, as I said, to kind of use our contact form on our website to get in touch with us, and we can kind of pick up a conversation directly there. But as I said, I'll give it about a minute and then I will come back to you. Okay, so a couple of questions that I am more than happy to answer. So some of you have just asked, is this webinar recorded? Just kind of to say yes, this webinar has been recorded, and we'll share a recording in the coming weeks if you want to recap some of what I've talked about here this evening. A couple of questions have been asked about the SAT, ACT standardized tests and how you sit them. Do you sit them in person? Are they online? So the SAT and the ACT do, it kind of answered that question as a yes and a no. They are digital tests, but they would require you to sit them at a test centre. So this is also something to be thinking about when you're looking at SAT or ACT. You might want to look at which test centres are near to you that offer either the ACT or SAT and which might be the best. There are multiple dates throughout the year, so you can also have a look and see which fit best with your schedule, with your calendar. But they are digital. So one thing to be aware of is that the ACT, you sit that in a test centre that will provide a device for you to complete. The test on generally with the SAT, you can or would be initially expected to bring your own device to sit it within a test centre. But there is support if you're not able to, if you don't have access to a device that would be able to kind of meet the technical requirements to sit the exam, you can get support to kind of apply for apply to have a device kind of be provided for you. Okay, a couple of other questions, which is, you know, do US universities put a lot of emphasis on GCSE grades when deciding to admit you? You know, ultimately they are going to be looking at your academic profile. So this is where I come back to, it's really important that you're looking at universities where you would be a competitive applicant. So looking at the average academic profiles of admitted students, you know, there are 4,500 universities. So there will be a university for you that will meet your grade profile, but it might require you to be open-minded and flexible, right? So if you're, as I kind of said, if you're looking at a ultra competitive university and you've got, you know, B's and C's, it's probably unlikely that those universities would be looking to admit you. But there may be other universities that, you know, are absolutely fine and kind of see strength in applicants that have got B's and C's. So it's just important that you're kind of thinking about that. As I said, academics are important. They'll look at your GCSEs, but they're also going to be looking at what you're studying now, what you're expected to achieve. But also, as I said, going back to this holistic admissions process, they want to get a sense of you as a person. And so that's not just your academics, it's what you're doing outside of the classroom, your extracurricular activities. It's how you demonstrate your fit for that university, what you might bring to campus. And that's not just coming through your GCSE grades, right? That you demonstrate that in a variety of different ways in the application. Someone's asked about Sutton Trust Fulbright US program applications. Any advice for that? I will say that we have had a webinar on that just a couple of weeks ago. The recording should be available on our website. But also, if you have questions, you can also reach out to us and we can kind of direct them to the team that can support with that. Just having a look at some other questions. Someone's asked, is the application process any different for someone who has taken a gap year and is applying during that year? Not generally. So ultimately, we would recommend that you apply the year, or as I said, like the 8 to 10 months, 12 months prior to when you would be expected to enroll. So if you're taking a gap year, we would recommend that you apply during your gap year. So what that's going to be, require you to do is make sure that you are, if you've left school, for example, that you've able to stay in communication with your school, because they're going to be the ones that are likely supporting with your transcript and with your recommendation letters. And so it's important that you've got those kind of methods of communication, and that they're able to support you with that. The other difference is that you'll be applying with achieved grades likely at that point. So something to kind of be aware of from a transcript perspective. But as I said, generally we would recommend that you apply for the year that you're on your gap year, i.e. the year prior to when you're intending to attend that university. Hopefully that makes sense. Just having a little look if there's any other questions that are coming through. There have been some questions about postgraduate study. As I said, there is a webinar coming up next week on postgraduate study, so I would recommend registering for that. I'd also recommend, if you've got questions about medicine, for example, we've got information on our website that can kind of talk a lot more directly about how you might apply for that and what that path might look like. Okay, trying to see if there's any other more general questions. Some questions, if I've not answered them today, you're more than welcome to email them in, and we can kind of pick up with you directly there. In terms of, I think some more questions about academics. Again, it's really important that you're looking at universities that you can meet the academic requirements for, but as again, it comes back to you as a person. If you're on an upward trajectory, if things have changed, if you've got context about GCSEs versus your A levels, that's where your counsellor comes in, right? You're those recommendation letters that can kind of talk to that as well. Okay, we are just out on time. And so I'm going to wrap up here. But what I will say is if your question's not been answered, you've still got questions, you're more than welcome to email in using our contact form that's on our website, and we can pick up with you there. But otherwise, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody for attending. Hopefully, this has been really helpful. And a helpful starting point. As I said, we're not going anywhere. We're here to support. So if you use our website, if you attend further events, if you email us directly, kind of we're here to help you on your educational journey to US study if that's of interest to you. But otherwise, wishing you a really great evening. And as I said, thank you again for attending.